Start by downloading our free pattern that is available on our website. By cutting your sheets this way, I was able to get four 4x6 sheets out of one 9x12 sheet. And I used watercolor paper. I also used my large sewing ruler to square up the page. And this is a photo of my pattern laid down over the 4x6. These are the supplies that I used. They're all gouache watercolor. So I started by wetting the paper, and I recommend using cold press paper if you're going to do a wet on wet technique like this. I had tried it with hot press, and hot press paper really soaks up the water. And for me, I just didn't care for it as well. So I started by putting in a very light background and then went back and loosely painted on the star yellow, and you can see that I go outside the lines. Then I came back and added a bit darker sky, so it looks like a little bit of a stormy night sky. Then I came back and started adding detail. Now I used carbon paper, and you can see that when you trace with carbon paper, lines show up pretty dark on your page. So if you don't like that, you can hold up the pattern to a window and trace through to your watercolor paper, or you can freehand draw. And I put down the light color first, then I went back over it with the darker color by just adding in a little bit of black. And this is now using the dry technique, wet on dry. It's wet paint, of course, over dry paper. The only wet on wet that I did was the background. Now by putting down the lines of the ground first, they kind of dry and stay. Then when I come back over it with a light wash, you can still see the original lines. And I like that because it gives definition to the ground. Then I let it dry overnight. Then the next day I came back and added a little bit of highlight. Now if you use watercolor paper, you don't really have to let it dry completely. But gouache paints work really well if you come back over it when it's dry. Now there I'm adding shadow. And I came in with a bit of black, and then with a very wet brush, I drew the black down onto the snowman. And I realized right away that I had way too much black. But that's okay because it was wet at this point. And all I had to do is get a paper towel and dab that up, and that took up the excess color. And the nice thing about gouache watercolor is you can actually go back over dark colored paint and it will cover it. So at this point, I'm adding more white to the snowman, and I'm starting to paint out the outlines that the carbon paper had made. If you have a light box, I recommend using that and very light pencil. You can even trace with a little bit of paint. Now here I'm using the white paint to just paint over the old carbon lines, carbon paper. Now I'm using my finer tip brush to add the little arm branches. I have found that I prefer to use cold press water paper, as I mentioned. Then I like to do the background washes with regular watercolor, and then I like to come back with gouache. Gouache is just a little bit thicker than regular watercolor, and I find it's easier to add detail. And you use very little water with it. Now I'm taking off the outside paper, and you notice the four little orange diamonds coming out from behind the star. I decided those were a little bit too dark. I later came back and whited those out a little bit. There you can see where I kind of blurred out that background star. And I realized that I needed to add shadow. Don't forget your shadows. There's a bright shining star behind the snowman in the tree. So I needed shadows under the tree and the snowman, and I added some white highlight on the tree side that faces the star. Then I come back with my micron, really, really small point pen, and it just kind of helps it pop, adding just a bit of detail where it's necessary. So this was a fun little painting that wasn't very difficult to do. And again, the pattern is available on our website. Feel free to download it, and you can enlarge it or shrink it. Thank you for watching.